Merci beaucoup. Comme on est en France, je vais commencer en français.
Thank you very much. Because we are in France, I will speak in French and also say how much we have been moved by the testimonies that we have here today. And I would like to say it in French because I know very well how much it need to have courage, to be courageous, to be able to bear a witness of what has happened to you in this conference, and we are very thankful to you for your testimonies. And I thank you, and then I will continue English because Mr. Hocken will not understand me. Okay.
About the prevailing climate of impunity that exists today in Iran. And unfortunately, I fear that it will not be the last time either that we talk about impunity in Iran. But that doesn't discourage us and nor stop us. We have to continue, I think, to denounce the systematic impunity of the regime in Iran and to defend the enormous courage of the defenders of human rights, and also for those who are doing that in difficult circumstances in exile. Because I think it's our common duty to denounce violations of democracy, violations of human rights everywhere in the world. And it is our duty to undo injustice and end to the suffering of people who stand up for democracy and who stand up for fundamental freedoms. As this is the beginning also of a new year, I would like briefly to reflect on some events that dominated the headlines last year. The first was naturally the COVID-19 pandemic that has infected more than 300 million people worldwide, that has caused more than 5 million people that succumbed to the virus, and many of them in Iran. And the second is naturally another event that I want to underline, the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan last August, the return of the Taliban there, what resulted in a sweep away of all the fragile freedoms that were acquired the past 20 years. And the third and finally last year was also a tipping point in terms of the what we call predicted domino effects of global warming. We have seen forest fires in Australia. We have seen deadly heat waves in California, erosion in the Mediterranean region, floods in a number of countries. So the consequences of global warming have become very tangible, I think, for everyone. And why do I mention these events here today? Because in all these cases, the population of Iran was even more affected than the other people living on this planet. Whether it was the uprising of the thirsty residents in the southern province of Khuzestan who took the streets against the water shortage, or a simple request of concerned men and women to tackle the pandemic with vigor, well, the authorities' answer, the answer of the regime remains always unchanged. They strike simply back. Don't solve the problem. Citizens who advocate the right to water, to advocate the right for a good health or a better living, were arrested and are now serving time behind bars. So the impunity crisis in Iran reached, I think, a peak last year in June, when another major event in Iran attracted worldwide attention. In my opinion, I have to tell you too briefly, namely the appointment of Raisi as the president of the regime. We all know that Raisi is one of the main perpetrators of the 1988 mass murder of more than 30,000 political prisoners. But instead of being tried and convicted of crimes against humanity, he was promoted to the position of President of Iran. And I think that his appointment is a stark reminder that impunity is rampant in Iran. I have to tell you the conclusion that I have drawn from an investigation that I did in another tragedy that happened, that was the events in Rwanda in 1994. I conducted then an inquiry as a senator. Well, my conclusion of that long investigation in that enormous dramatic genocide in Rwanda of 1994 is that the architects and perpetrators of genocide must always be brought to justice. And that is what happened to the instigators. That is what happened to the instigators, and still is happening to the instigators of the genocide in Rwanda. Up to this day, the guilty are brought before court and sentenced, whatever their age is, no matter how long the killings have taken place. There is, dear friends, no legal expiry period on such crimes. Crimes against humanity can never go unpunished. We are all still shocked, in fact, by the genocide that took place in that summer of 1988 in Iran. It was of an unprecedented horror and scale, as up to 30,000 innocent men and women died a terrible death, only because they were striving for a free and a prosperous Iran. And as long as the guilty are not brought to justice, are not punished, it must, I think, be our duty to take every opportunity to express our outrage at the atrocities and the lack of justice. In 1988, let's be honest about it, the international community passively turned its head away from the killings, despite repeated calls from the Iranian resistance for an investigation, a proper investigation. And let's be honest also about it, this passivity continues to this day. As long as we remain blind to the terrible crimes committed by that regime, we remain also blind, I think, to the endless grief of the affected families and the many Iranian citizens who are living in exile since then. And drawing up an official report on the horrific events of 1988 is also, I think, of a major importance for those who suffered and who survived, because only when justice is done, that is the reality, then they will finally find peace also. And that is why, and I want to repeat it here today, it is high time now for the United Nations to launch an official inquiry. As not launching such an inquiry also creates, I think, a dangerous precedent. Remaining passive to the atrocities and continued gross violations of human rights results in inviting, and not only the authorities in Iran, but all authoritarian regimes where human rights are trampled, to continue simply their practices, torturing, killing, and to think that they get away with it in the long run. So in the case of Iran, failure to investigate, in fact, the atrocities of 1988 by the international community gives the regime today a green light to continue simply its brutal practices against its own population. It's not only a question of the past, it's mainly a question of what is happening today and what will happen in the future in Iran, why this investigation is needed. In fact, the detention, torture, killing of union delegates, of environmentalists, of lawyers, of children's rights activists has in fact reached frightening proportions since Raisi came to power. People are bullied or locked up receive outrageous and ridiculous punishments because they peacefully raised their voices for a free and for a fair Iran. Zavahid Reichman, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Iran, also expressed his concerns on the increase of violence and the terrifying number of executions, especially in 2021. While the carrying out of a death sentence, for example, to give you that comparison, in Oklahoma, in the United States, in October last year, dominated the news for days and provoked reactions worldwide, it was unnoticed that at least 31 prisoners were hanged in Iran during that same month. But once again, these serious abuses, although officially reported, go unpunished. And because they go unpunished, they will continue, and they will even increase. So it's time to give these acts of aggression against the people of Iran the highest priority now in the international community. And that is why we should put Iran and the fight against impunity again high on the political agenda. And instead of being silent witnesses of the deteriorating state of Iran, it is of the utmost importance to shape our strategy and foreign policy with Iran by putting our concerns about human rights violations in the forefront. The well-being of the people of Iran should be, I think, a red line. We are talking about red lines every day in international politics. Well, this is a red line at all times in bilateral talks and in negotiations. And I think that this firm policy, this red line, should also concern the nuclear deal with Iran. The ongoing talks on the denuclearization of Iran cannot, in my eyes, be a simple smokescreen not to tackle the human rights issue in Iran. And therefore, I think it's absolutely crucial to open in these talks also a specific chapter on the human rights situation and the rule of law and the lack of democracy in Iran. So let me conclude. Today, the situation of human rights and its defenders in Iran is critical. I think it's also worse than it has ever been for the last 30 years. Conditions in prisons are more and more disgraceful. Justice is completely non-existent. And as a result of intensified repression, anyone who stands up for his fellow citizens risks being tortured, killed for doing so. So I repeat, urgent international action is needed to turn this tide. And for that, I reiterate the need to make progress for an official and a profound report on the killings of 1988, but it all started there. Finally, investigating the massacre of '88 and holding the guilty responsible will open the way, I think, for all Iranian people, where they live in Iran or in exile, to design a new future for their beloved country. And in my quest for an official investigation under the auspices of the United Nations, I will continue to urge Joseph Borrell, our High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, to take the necessary steps to obtain it. So please allow me also to say a few words, especially to you, to the tireless work done by the Iranian people in exile, because I know that leaving your hearts and relatives and a country one loves behind to continue your struggle for a better Iran deserve more than our appreciation. I can imagine that the conditions in which you, as victim of repression, continue your mission are often precarious. There is always the risk that your relatives who stayed behind can be physically attacked, can be silenced because of your commitment, but it is thanks to the people in exile, that's important to tell you that we have a clear window also, a clear view on what is really happening in Iran today. So your cause for justice is also our concern, and I think that the best way to predict a better future for the people of Iran is to create that ourselves. And I think together, international community and you, we can make it work. Thank you very much.